Continuing my series on World War II tanks that need adding to War Thunder, we now move on to American World War II tanks. And you would think there aren't many American tank types left to add, but there are still a whole bunch of American variants to existing tanks like the Sherman, and even a few whole new tank types, with some of these being prototypes, but others were accepted into service and built in large numbers. So we'll start off with some of the American light tanks, or more specifically light tanks developed by the Marmon Herrington Company, who built a large variety of different tank types in large numbers, like the CTLS Forte and CTLS Fortac, the former being fitted with a left-mounted turret and the latter a right-mounted one, and 474 of these were built, primarily for the Dutch and Chinese, but when the latter rejected these tanks, 240 entered US service as the T-16, with many serving in Alaska until 1943. Unfortunately, the T-16s, like most Marmon Herrington tanks, were only armed with small caliber machine guns, so probably couldn't be added, but there were a few of their tanks that were armed with more substantial weapons, and these could be added, like the CTL-3, a tank derived from the CTL-1 that had been developed for Persia, and 5 CTL-3s would be bought by the Marine Corps in 1937. The CTL-3 was a very light two-man tank, coming in at just 5 tons, which was a desirable trait for the Marine Corps due to a weight limit for unloading tanks from ships and lighters. This meant the tank had very limited armour, coming in at a maximum of 12.7mm, and it was found in testing in 1938 that even 22 caliber rounds could cause bullet splash through the vision ports, so overall this was an extremely vulnerable tank. That said, it was also pretty speedy, capable of a top speed of 31 miles per hour or 55 kilometers an hour, great for getting around the battlefield, but the armament is unfortunately a little bit on the light side, having one 50 cal M2 Browning machine gun and two 30 cal Colt machine guns mounted at the front. That said, the 50 cal can penetrate up to 29mm of armour at 100 metres, and we do have the M2A2 in game that also uses a Browning 50 cal machine gun as its primary weapon. And the CTL-3 would actually have an advantage in that its 50 cal covers the entire front side of the tank, while the M2A2's 50 cal machine gun, despite being in a turret, only mostly covers the left side of the tank, with very limited traverse towards the right. Bearing that in mind, in-game this would of course be a 1.0 tank due to its low armour and limited armament, but it could still see some minor successes in the early tiers, especially with its quick speed and fast firing albeit less powerful weapon. In real life, the Marine Corps was not particularly happy with the CTL-3, seeing the design as too light and fragile for a fighting vehicle, and it was pointed out that the 5-ton limit was far too restrictive compared with what the Navy could actually deal with. So the search was on for a new tank, but due to rapid rearmament brought about by the start of World War II, more CTL-3s and later CTL-6s would be bought, while the existing CTL-3s would be upgraded. Meanwhile, the search for a heavier tank led to the Marines buying yet another Marmon Herrington design, the CTM-3TBD medium tank, which was essentially an upgraded CTL-3 with a new suspension system, but also now armed with two 50 caliber Browning machine guns fitted in a turret, improving the usefulness of this tank compared to the CTL-3, while 3 30 cal Colt machine guns are mounted at the front of the hull. Yeah, for some reason Marmon Herrington tanks mostly used the Colt MG38B2 machine gun, which is based off of the Browning 1917, but the parts between the two are not interchangeable, so it just seems like a worse machine gun overall, to be honest. Unfortunately, it still only has 12.7mm of armour and a 2-man crew, while the top speed should be slightly reduced due to the additional weight from the turret, but it should still be a pretty fast tank. Again, like the CTL-3, this could be a 1.0 tank, keeping most of the rather good top speed while having a much better turret-mounted armament, and it would be nice for this rather unknown tank to be added to War Thunder. In real life, only 5 CTM-3TBDs would be built, and like with the other Marmon Herrington tanks, it was not particularly well liked, only really being kept around due to a lack of anything else being available. Naturally, once the Marine Corps started to receive much better M2A4 and M3 light tanks, these rapidly replaced the Marmon Herrington vehicles, with the majority being stationed in Samoa in the Pacific, and these were scraps from 1943 onwards. So the Marmon Herrington tanks we've looked at so far haven't been particularly impressive, and their medium tanks that we will look at later were not very good either. But they did also produce a far more known light tank, the M22 Locust. Now this tank is already in-game, but we could potentially get the initial prototype of this tank, the T9, which came about after a request by the British Purchasing Commission in 1941 for a tank that could be deployed by air. Initially, Walter Christie, who we have covered extensively in my American Interwar Tanks episode, was approached to present a design, which made sense as he had previously made the Christie M1932 flying tank, giving him a head start over other designers. So Christie went away and produced a pilot model, but this didn't meet requirements and would have required a specialised aircraft to be developed for transporting it. So this design was knocked out of the running, but could be added if required. At this point, Marmon Herrington were approached and produced their own design, with a wooden model made in 1941 and a proper pilot model in April 1942, known as the T9. Now, in many respects, the T9 is actually superior to the production version it would be developed into, as it features a powered traverse system for the turret, and the elevation was stabilised, allowing for more accurate shooting, especially when on the move, while an additional 230 cal machine guns are fitted to the front of the hull, boosting firepower against soft-skin vehicles. You can also see that the armour profile for the front is different, being more flat-sided for the main superstructure compared to the sloping of the M22 design. But to be honest, with the armour maxing out at 25.4mm and usually being just 12.7mm thick, it's unlikely this will make a huge amount of difference. Other than that, its stats should be about the same as the M22, having a 37mm gun and coaxial machine gun, a maximum of 25.4mm of armour for the turret and nose of the tank, a top speed of 35 miles per hour, and a crew of 3, though the weight is increased, being over the 7.9 tonne limit that was set for the project. In War Thunder, I could see this being a cool premium tank at 2.0, having most of the advantages of the M22 while being able to target enemies quicker and more accurately due to its powered traverse and vertical stabiliser, and all in all I think this would make for a very fun tank in the early tiers. In real life, while the tank had many useful features, these made the tank overweight for its intended role as an airborne tank, so a new modified design was made, which was the T9E1, which would remove the powered traverse, vertical stabiliser and hull-mounted machine guns in order to cut down on the weight, while the hull was also redesigned to improve protection, and it was in this form that it would go into production as the M22, though it would only see limited service towards the end of World War II, with the design by now obsolete. So ultimately, Marmon Herrington's tanks, while seeing service with US troops and even seeing combat against the Japanese in the Dutch East Indies, were not particularly good designs and were generally replaced as soon as better tanks came along. Of course, however, there were more light tanks than what Marmon Herrington produced in the early part of the war, like the more well-known M3 Stuart and M5 light tanks. But to be fair, Gaijin has done a very good job of adding their major variants in-game, with all of the major variants of the M3 Stuart already in-game, if not in the US tech tree, while the initial M5 does still need add-in, but its only difference from the in-game M5A1 is using the M3A1 turret, so it's not a huge priority for add-in. That said, when it comes to the late war M24 Chaffee light tank, there are quite a few experimental models that could be added, starting with the T24E1, which was the first M24 Chaffee pilot model converted to use the Continental R975 C-Force radial engine from the M18 Hellcat, and a Spicer automatic torque converter transmission. Now, as this was based off the initial pilot model, there are a few minor changes to the tank itself. For example, a commander's cupola wasn't included, and a muzzle brake is installed on the 75mm gun. And the engine compartment at the rear is also much larger to accommodate the new engine. So looking at mobility first, this is greatly improved over the regular M24, now having a top speed of 48 miles per hour or 77 kilometers an hour, compared to 35 miles per hour or 56 kilometers an hour for the M24. So this will now be a true speed demon, being able to get around maps almost as handily as the M18. The rest of the stats are pretty much the same as the regular M24, and I could see this being a great light tank at 4.0 or higher, giving the US tech tree a ridiculously fast light tank for scouting and flanking in Tier 2, while still retaining the good 75mm gun and 5-man crew, though still being easy to take down due to its thin armour. In real life, the T-24E1 was tested at the Aberdeen Proving Ground from October 1944 and was found to be far more mobile than the existing M24. But unfortunately, the new transmission was found to be rather unreliable. That said, they must have really seen the potential in this new design because they tested it until November 1945. But with the M24 itself halting production in August 1945, and the war having been over for quite a few months by this point, there was just no demand for a new light tank, and so the T-24E1 project was ended. There would be other attempts at improving the mobility of the M24. For example, one variant that was tested incorporated the suspension from the German SDKFZ-8 half-track, though the turret wasn't installed for these tests. Ultimately, the new suspension didn't show much of an improvement, so no other tanks were converted, but it could make for an interesting event tank. It was also possible to fit 28-inch Grousers onto the M24 tracks to help lower the ground pressure, much like the German Ostketten tracks for the Panzer III and IV, and this could be introduced as a modification that could be installed on existing M24s if the player chooses to do so. There were also various attempts to improve the firepower of the M24. For example, this M24 was fitted with two T-45 launchers, which could launch 20 Navy 4.5-inch Beach Barrage or Old Faithful HE rockets, which had just under 3 kilograms of TNT explosive filler. Compare that to the M8 rockets from the Calliope that have 1.9 kilograms of explosive and a penetration of 24.4 millimeters, and you can see that the Old Faithful rockets should perform a fair bit better. Aiming the rockets would require turning the entire turret, as the launcher has no way of traversing horizontally, but elevation can be controlled, making aiming a bit easier. Overall, I could see this being a premium or event tank at the M24's usual battle rating of 3.7, as the rockets, while interested in helping out on some occasions, are unlikely to make the tank much more lethal than the existing M24, but I would still like to see this rather unusual variant added in game. In real life, only one tank was tested with these rockets for trials, and presumably wasn't considered successful enough to consider modifying any more. There was also another attempt to improve the machine gun firepower of the M24, this time by fitting the T122 twin machine gun mount in place of the usual commander's cupola. The T122 mount was fitted with two 50 cal Browning machine guns, though 30 cal machine guns could also be fitted, doubling the available firepower from the machine guns to use against enemy aircraft or soft-skin vehicles, while the ability to traverse 360 degrees is a massive improvement over the current roof-mounted 50 cal machine gun, which has limited traverse and relies mainly on the turret turning to engage fast-moving enemy aircraft. The mount itself has 12.7mm of armour, which isn't very good, and of course the size of the T122 mount does make the tank a far more obvious target, which isn't great for a light tank that relies on not being spotted. I could see this being either a modification available for existing M24 tanks, or as a separate variant folded with it, and this would open up quite a few options when used in game. For example, if a player is unsure on whether to spawn in an anti-air vehicle, they can use this variant and have the ability to take down enemy aircraft and enemy tanks, though of course it won't be suited to the former role as well as a dedicated anti-air vehicle, but regardless this would be a fun tank to have in game. In real life, the T122 was mounted in July 1947 and tested until June 1948. And while it wasn't adopted, it was recommended to develop an improved machine gun mount with 360 degree coverage, so it must have at least proved the concept was worth pursuing. So now that we've looked at the light tanks, we can move on to looking at American medium tanks. And again, I will start off by looking at some Marmon Herrington designs with some rather interesting features. These being the CTMS ITB-1 and the MTLS 1GI-4. Which long-time viewers of the channel may remember from my episode on Dutch tanks, as the Netherlands were the ones who originally ordered them for use in the Dutch East Indies. However, these never made it to the Dutch East Indies due to the Japanese invasion, so the US took possession of these tanks and decided to test them to see if they wanted to put them into service themselves. We'll start off by looking at the CTMS or Combat Tank Medium series, of which 194 were built, and this tank is rather unusual in that it is primarily armed with a 37mm autocannon that was designed by the American Arms Corporation, though tests from the Aberdeen Proving Ground describe this as a semi-automatic gun. Unfortunately, I haven't found much information on this weapon, other than the fact it fired from 5-round clips had a muzzle velocity of around 610 metres a second, and maybe could penetrate 25mm of hardened steel, though I'm unsure at what distance or angle this was referring to. That said, it should be a faster firing tank than most of its contemporaries, as well as being quick to reload as it uses 5-round clips, making this a rather deadly tank. It also had a coaxial 30 caliber Colt machine gun, while another 3 could be mounted at the front of the hull, giving some good defence against soft skin vehicles. The armour is again 12.7mm thick, so not particularly great, while the top speed for the 12-ton tank is now 25 mph or 40km/h. Still decent, but far worse than the CTL-3 tanks we looked at earlier, while a crew of 3 was carried, again making this tank rather vulnerable to crew losses. I could see this tank working at 1.0, having a rather interesting main armament and a decent speed, though it will be vulnerable if it gets into straight up fights with other tanks. In real life, 61 of the CTMS tanks would be sent to other nations, namely 3 Dutch forces in Dutch Guiana, as well as Ecuador, Cuba and Guatemala, with the remaining 133 staying in the United States, while testing was carried out at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. These tests didn't go particularly well, as these tanks were not adopted by the US and the entire remaining stock of tanks were scrapped, though the one tested at Aberdeen was still around until at least 1946, before it too was presumably scrapped. This then brings us to the MTLS, of which 125 were built, which was also tested at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The Chieftain made a rather interesting video about this tank named The Worst Tank You Never Heard Of, which is a rather good indicator on how these tests went and of the tank's overall design. But of course most of the things that happened in the tests, like the inability to get the gun working properly, wouldn't occur in War Thunder, so we can still cover it and it could still be added. First of all, you might notice the MTLS is a rather rare example of a double-barrelled tank, with 2 37mm AAC autocannons being fitted, essentially doubling the firepower of the tank, or alternatively allowing for one gun to be used against a target, and then switching to the other gun while the first is reloading, allowing for a constant stream of fire. The secondary armament is also pretty good, with a grand total of 7 30 cal Colt machine guns, 1 in a coaxial position, pintle mounts for 2 more at the rear of the turret, 1 in a ball mount on the right side of the turret, 2 mounted in fixed positions in the whole front, and the last in a ball mount at the whole front, giving this tank a rather ridiculous amount of firepower against soft skin vehicles and enemy aircraft. Armour has also been improved, now maxing out at 38mm, so it's no longer at risk from machine gun fire and even protected against some small caliber tank guns, though the armour is riveted, which would be an issue in real life. The crew has also now been increased, with 4 now being carried, making the tank less vulnerable to crew losses, while the top speed is 25 mph or 40km/h, which isn't too bad for a 20-ton tank, though the suspension was based on the CTL tanks that weighed less than 10 tons, which you have to imagine had a rather undesirable effect on the vehicle's manoeuvrability. I could see this tank working at 1.0, maybe 1.3, depending on how effective its main guns are, as it now has improved armour, a decent main armament and more crew. And while not the best tank in the world, it would do decently well in game, and it would be nice to see this rather unusual tank in War Thunder. In real life, the MTLS would be rejected after testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the report saying that the tank was, quote, thoroughly unreliable, mechanically and structurally unsound, underpowered and equipped with unsatisfactory armament, and then goes on to say, quote, not a satisfactory combat vehicle for any branch of the armed forces, end quote. Bear in mind, this came at a time when the US now had Shermans and M5 light tanks in service, which were infinitely more useful than the MTLS or CTMS. That said, some MTLS tanks would be sent to Dutch Guiana in South America, but a lack of troops meant not all of the tanks could be operated. So in 1946 they were sent to storage, and when taken out of storage just a year later in 1947, were found in such a bad state that only some could be reactivated, and most would break down or be scrapped over the next 10 years, never seeing any combat service. So the Marmon Herrington medium tanks were a complete and utter failure, at least in US service, but the US Army had access to far better designs that were used in large numbers, like the M3 Lee and M4 Sherman, and both of these tanks have variants that need adding. Starting with the M3 Medium, but also known by the British designations of M3 Lee and M3 Grant, we only have one variant in game, that being the initial production M3 Medium with riveted armour. But there are quite a few variants that still need adding, starting with the M3A1, with the main difference being that this uses cast as opposed to riveted armour, giving it a smoother appearance, while the left side of the hull is noticeably different compared to the riveted model. This could potentially be an upgrade or a downgrade, as the more sloped armour might potentially deflect more shots than the armour of the original M3, but in-game cast armour has a negative modifier. So for the regular M3s, the thickest armour plate of 50.8mm is riveted RHA armour plate, which gives a 1.0 multiplier, meaning it gives the full 50.8mm of protection, while the M3A1's cast armour has a 0.94 multiplier, meaning that the same cast armour thickness only provides 47.7mm of protection. Not a huge difference, but it is there nonetheless. It should also be noted that 28 M3A1s were fitted with diesel engines, which gave better performance compared to the usual petrol engines and could also be added if needed. With the rest of the stats remaining the same, I could see the M3A1 being added at 2.7, probably folded with the M3 Lee, with its place in game really depending on how much difference the cast armour makes, while potentially the diesel engine variant could also be added, which would make up for any difference in the armour, and it would be nice for this unusual looking M3 variant to be added in game. In real life only 300 M3A1s were made, out of 6,258, so it was a relatively uncommon variant, and in the subsequent M3A2 it was decided to revert to the more angular hull, though this time welding was used for the armour, which in real life is better than riveted armour, but in game doesn't really have any effect, so wouldn't add much if added in game, and in real life only 12 M3A2s were built, so this seems to have been more of a testbed for welded armour more than anything else. Presumably the M3A2's welded armour was considered fairly successful however, as it was used again in the M3A3, but the far bigger difference in this tank was the use of a GM 6046 diesel engine, with previous M3s mostly using petrol engines, and this new diesel engine, as well as reducing the risk of fire, was also a bit more powerful, giving an improved top speed of 30 mph or 48 km/h, compared to the initial M3's 24 mph or 39 km/h, making the M3A3 a more mobile tank and a better choice for getting around the battlefield, and again this could be folded with the regular M3 medium tank, or perhaps just after it on the tech tree. We then come to the M3A4, again another unusual looking M3 variant, with the hull being stretched to incorporate a new Chrysler A57 multi-bank engine, which is essentially 5 6-cylinder L-head car engines, and this turned out to be pretty powerful, producing 470 horsepower, bearing in mind the original engine only did 400 horsepower, and a lot more torque was also produced compared to the previous engines, about 1060 foot-pounds versus 890 for the previous M3s, again making this a rather powerful tank indeed mobility-wise, though the top speed seems to have remained 24 mph or 39 km/h. Again, this could be folded with the M3 or added as its own separate vehicle, being a bit more capable at getting across obstacles and difficult terrain, and again it would give us another unusual looking M3 medium tank for those playing the US tech tree. Ultimately only 109 of the M3A4 would be built, with these remaining in the US for training purposes, though the Chrysler A57 multibank engine would go on to be used on the M4A4 Sherman, which would be built in larger numbers. Lastly, for the M3 medium variants we have the M3A5, which is essentially just the M3A3 but with a riveted instead of welded hull, and again I could see this being folded with the M3 or added as a premium or offense tank, as in game it would have virtually no difference to the M3A3, as the disadvantages of riveted armour are not really replicated in game. So as we can see, there are still quite a few M3 medium variants that need adding, but these often weren't made in large numbers, which makes sense as the tank was intended more as a stopgap until the next tank would be ready, which of course would be the M4 Sherman, a tank that was produced in great numbers and gives us a bewildering number of different variants and experimental models to look at. However, we will start off by looking at its initial prototype form, designated the medium tank T6, which began development in February 1941, once design work was finished on the M3 medium, with a wooden mock-up being produced later in the year. Interestingly, this mock-up seems to have been used to test some ideas. For example, at one point they tested a larger turret with a 75mm gun and coaxial 37mm gun, more reminiscent to the M3 medium tank, though obviously this idea was dropped. However, when looking at the pilot model of the T6 that was completed on 2nd September 1941, we do see that some other features from the M3 were kept. For example, the commander's cupola was fitted with a machine gun, and two 30-cal machine guns are fixed in place on the frontal hull, alongside the usual ball mount and coaxial machine gun as found on regular Shermans. It also retains the shorter M2 length 31 75mm gun, instead of the M3 length 40 75mm gun as fitted to the regular Sherman, with the M2 having a reduced penetration of 87mm at 500 metres and a muzzle velocity of 588 metres a second, versus 93mm at 500 metres for the M3 and a muzzle velocity of 618 metres a second, making the M2 a marginally worse performing gun. You can also see other minor additions that would later be changed on the production Shermans, such as the antenna being mounted on the whole front, which could be hit and entangled with the main gun, and these grab handles fitted on the side of the tank. Beyond this, it was still to have 5 crew, a top speed of 24 miles per hour or 38 kilometers an hour, and a maximum armour thickness of 76mm, which in the initial pilot model was cast armour, but a second prototype was built shortly after with rolled homogeneous armour plate, though there aren't any photos of this prototype. In theory, we could get the cast and welded armour versions, with one being as an event vehicle and the other hopefully being added as a regular vehicle, perhaps between the M3 Lee and M4 Sherman at 3.0. And it would be nice to have this initial prototype added to the game to showcase how American tank design changed from the M3 to the M4 Sherman. In real life, the welded and cast armour versions would be adopted as the M4 and M4A1 respectively, while the T6 prototype would stick around until at least 1947, last seen being used to test additional armour for the differential housing, though it seems likely it was scrapped sometime after this. So the Sherman would of course go on to be adopted with multiple variants, with most of these being included in War Thunder, if not necessarily in the American tech tree. So the M4, M4A1, M4A2 and M4A3 are all in-game and in the American tech tree, while the M4A4 is in-game but not in the American tech tree, which kind of makes sense as the Americans didn't really use this variant themselves, mostly giving it over to other nations. But it's odd that France and China get it while Britain doesn't, as Britain received 7,167 of the 7,499 produced, or just over 95%, while France and China used it in far lower numbers. So when it comes to major Sherman variants, that leaves just the M4A5 and M4A6, except the M4A5 is just the designation for the Canadian Ram tanks, so really we just have the M4A6 to look at for major variants. And this is actually a composite Sherman, with the front of the hull being cast and joined to an enlarged welded hull from the M4A4, which was needed to incorporate the new RD1820 air-cooled engine, which could run on a variety of fuels from diesel to lower octane petrol, and produces 450 horsepower, which gives it a top speed of 30 miles per hour or 48 kilometers an hour, which would make this the fastest Sherman variant in game, just beating out the M4A2's 29.2 miles per hour. Unfortunately, only the 75mm gun is available for this tank, which is a bit of a shame, but this would make a good tank at 4.0, either folded with the other 75mm Shermans or as an event tank, giving us a slightly faster Sherman tank, and would allow us to experience the last major Sherman variant that's still to be added in War Thunder. Despite the better performance and fuel economy from the new engine, only 75 M4A6s would be produced, with the M4A3 and its Ford engine being the preferred tank for US Army service. So that is all of the major variants of the Sherman, but of course there are a whole bunch of sub-variants that still need adding. For example, the M4-105, which is the initial M4 Sherman but with a 105mm howitzer, which could be folded with the M4A3-105, and of course the initial version of the M4A3, which was armed with the 75mm gun in either dry or wet stowage variants, and could also be fitted with the VVS suspension, and this would round out the 75mm armed Shermans. Of course, outside of the regular variants and sub-variants, there were also a lot of attempts at upgunning or generally improving the Sherman tank. Which leads us to the M4A1 76M1, which was an attempt to fit the new T1 76mm gun into the turret of the 75mm armed M4A1. Now, this new 76mm gun was based on the M7 3-inch gun from the M10, and this was intended to have the same performance, while being lighter yet having a longer barrel of 57 calibers or 4.34 meters in length. Now, things get a bit interesting here because the gun was installed in an M4A1 but had to be cut down to 4 meters due to the barrel drooping, though it still retained the same performance as the M7 3-inch gun. However, the initial longer barrel version could still be included in War Thunder, as the barrel drooping is unlikely to be represented in game, meaning the longer barrel might give a slightly better performance against enemy armour, giving us a rather powerful version of the Sherman, while the version with the cut down barrel could also be added, with both versions having longer reload times due to the guns not leaving much space in the turret. So the shorter barrel version could be added at 4.7 to 5.0, while the longer barrel version could be added at 5.0, and it could be used in a more tank destroyer-like role. In real life, 12 of these tanks would be built and 1,000 ordered due to seeming to be a successful design, but these plans were overturned when the armoured force turned out to be less enthusiastic about the design, citing the lack of space in the turret due to the size of the new guns, meaning tankers would have to wait for the larger T-23 turret to be developed and fitted to the Sherman before they could get the more powerful gun. Oddly enough, there would be renewed attempts at fitting the 76mm gun into 75mm turrets after the war, mainly by various allied armies, but also by the United States itself, mainly with an eye on keeping the more up-to-date Shermans and components for themselves, while still supplying friendly nations with decent tanks, leading to the M4A1E6 and M4A3E4. The M4A1E6 would be given the 76mm gun in the original 75mm armed turret, with these sometimes fitted with muzzle brakes, and these tanks would often receive an upgraded VVS suspension from the M4A1E9, which might help mobility a little bit. Meanwhile, the M4A3E4 had a similar upgrade, but without the improved suspension or muzzle brake, though they were still modified to receive the muzzle brakes if needed, helping to visually identify this variant over the E6. Meanwhile, the radio was also relocated to free up room in the turret, which might help with the reload rate. I could see these tanks being added as event tanks or in the US tech tree at 5.0 to 5.3, depending on the variant. And while not the greatest tank in the world, it would be nice to see these upgraded Shermans in-game. In real life, these weren't really used by the US Army, but were instead sent to friendly nations, or nations that the US wanted to build ties with, like Denmark, India, Pakistan, Portugal and Yugoslavia, helping these nations to build up their tank forces in the immediate aftermath of the war. Of course, as it turns out, once a larger turret was installed, it became far easier to install the 76mm gun on the Sherman tank. But even with this boost in firepower, American tank crews still often found themselves unable to take out more heavily armoured German tanks like the Panther or Tiger, which led to calls for yet a more powerful weapon. A weapon that could be at least as powerful as the British 17-pounder, which of course by now had been mounted in British Sherman tanks, becoming the Firefly. The 90mm gun was being developed by this point, but something needed to be done in the short term. At first, this was a request from General Omar Bradley for Fireflies to be provided until better guns could be delivered, but between equipping its own forces and Allied forces, Britain didn't have any to spare. With Britain unable to supply tanks, it was simply decided that American tanks would be converted by Britain instead, which after much delay began in March 1945, with the new tanks being known in American service as the Sherman 17-pounder, with M4s and M4A3s being used for the conversion work. Weirdly enough, only Shermans with the original turrets for the 75mm gun were converted, as although larger, the T-23 turret needed extensive modifications to fit the 17-pounder. Ultimately, 100 tanks would be converted, and roughly 80 or so tanks would be delivered, with most of these being M4A3s, though overall numbers converted do differ from source to source. In-game, 17-pounder armed Shermans would be an interesting addition to the US tech tree, as the 17-pounder had a better penetration compared to the 76mm gun, with its APC-BC shell being capable of penetrating 172mm of armour at 500m versus 131mm for the M62 shell for the 76mm gun. Though of course British shells are solid shot, while the M62 has an explosive filler, causing much more damage after penetration. That said, the Sherman 17-pounders could work in-game at 4.7 like the British Fireflies, bridging the gap between the M4A2 and M4A176W, and it would be cool for American players to have a chance of using these unique tanks. In real life, on the 8th of April 1945, after the first 80 or so converted tanks were received by the US, the order for conversions were cancelled, as the M26 Pershing with its 90mm gun was now entering service, and the remaining 20 or so tanks were given to Britain. As for the tanks received by the US Army, it's possible that they might have been used on the Italian front, where it's known that some Fireflies were used by American forces, though in this case it seems they were taken from local British troops, so they might not actually have been sent here from US Army stocks, and ultimately it seems like the Sherman 17-pounders were either scrapped or reconverted back to their original state, or given the T-23 turret and 76mm gun, thus ending the tale of these little known tanks. Before we leave the Sherman, however, there were also many variants where the tank itself was unchanged, but additional weaponry was installed, usually rocket launchers, which were fitted atop the tank, the most famous of these being the T-34 Calliope with its 60 114mm M8 rockets. However, there were other rocket launchers tested on the M4 Sherman, such as the T-40/M17 Whiz-Bang, which is capable of firing 20 7.2-inch rockets up to 200 metres at an elevation of -2 to +25 degrees. Now you might be wondering, how is this any different to the Calliope? Surely they play fairly similarly. Well, the Calliope's rockets, despite weighing 17.2 kilograms, have a payload of just 1.95 kilograms of explosives, giving a maximum penetration of 24.4 millimeters. The Whiz-Bang's rockets, on the other hand, are the T-37 Demolition rocket, which was derived from the naval Mousetrap anti-submarine rocket, so naturally these rockets were much larger, at 27.6 kilograms and carried 14.5 kilograms of plastic explosive. So to put that in context, the KV-2's HE shell has 5.82 kilograms of explosive, or less than half that of the Whiz-Bang, while the German Brummbau's 150mm HE shells only have 8.6 kilograms of explosives. In fact, there seem to be very few vehicles with comparable shells or rockets, with some of these being the Sturm Tiger or Russian RBT-5, the latter of whose rockets have 130 kilograms of explosive, but it only carries 2 of them versus 20 for the Whiz-Bang. Of course, with such large rockets there are some downsides. For example, the launcher makes for a rather obvious target, though it is fitted with 12.7mm of armour, so shell splinters and light machine guns won't set off the rockets, and the range of the rockets themselves is only 200 metres or so, while their velocity is just under 50 metres a second, making these inaccurate for long-range shooting, but in close-range engagements they would be absolutely lethal, with all of the rockets being capable of being fired in just under 10 seconds if stuck in a dire situation. Of course, I can't say exactly what the penetration of these rockets would be, but I would suspect it would be in the 50+ millimeters range, making these rather effective against enemy tanks. As for its place in War Thunder, I would think about a rating of 4.7 or higher would be a good place for the Whiz-Bang, as you still have all the other excellent characteristics of the Sherman, plus the 75mm gun, but now with devastating rockets that would quickly turn the tide in close-range engagements. And it would be nice for this deadly cousin of the Calliope to be included in War Thunder. In real life, while the Whiz-Bang was intended to be used in the Normandy invasion, it ultimately was not ready in time and had very limited use in Europe. The Marines would also test the Whiz-Bang with an eye on using it in the Pacific, but this ultimately didn't pan out. So that is most of the Sherman variants that need adding to War Thunder, but there are of course other medium tanks that were being developed during World War II. Some as potential successors and some that sort of accidentally came into the medium tank scene. And some of these were just prototypes, and others were built in very large numbers and were even accepted into service, which allows them to be added into War Thunder. For these alternative medium tank designs, we will start off by looking at the M7 medium tank. Now the M7 medium was originally proposed in January 1941, not as a medium tank, but as the T7 light tank, and 2 pilot models were ordered. The T7 with a welded hull and the T7E1 with a riveted hull, and a proposed weight of 14 tonnes. By July 1941 a wooden mock-up was ready, and more pilot models were ordered, these being the T7E2, E3 and E4, while the weight had now been increased to 16 tonnes. The T7 would be finished in January 1942 with a welded hull and cast turret, and a Continental W670 radial engine, while the T7E1 would only get its hull assembled as riveted armour was by now clearly inferior to cast or welded armour. The T7E2 would be finished with a cast upper hull and turret, and was fitted with a high-power Wright Whirlwind R975 EC2 engine, and was also given a more powerful gun, as instead of the 37mm gun as planned in the previous tanks, it was to be armed with the British 57mm 6-pounder Mark III, which can penetrate 101mm of armour at 500 metres with its APC-BC shell, versus 73mm for the 37mm gun. So this is quite a good improvement, but all these changes meant that the tank now weighed in at 26 tonnes, so it could hardly count as a light tank by this point. However, despite the good performance of the tank and its gun, Armoured Force rejected the use of the 6-pounder, preferring instead the American 75mm gun, which only penetrates 93mm at 500 metres with the M61 shell, but that shell has an explosive filler and superior HE shell to compensate. The 75mm gun would subsequently be installed in the T7E2, which would now be designated the T7E5. So looking at the T7E5, it has the 75mm gun and 3 7.62mm Browning machine guns, these being placed in the bow, coaxial and roof position, giving good all-round fire, though it is surprising that a Browning 50 cal wasn't fitted on the roof, but this could be a holdover from its intended light tank role. Meanwhile, the armour maxes out at 38mm for the hull and 64mm for the turret, and while this is decently sloped, it is worse than tanks like the Sherman, which wasn't a problem when it was filling the light tank role, but by the time it reached 26 tonnes, it was now more of a medium tank, though it does have a faster top speed than the Sherman at 30 mph or 48 km/h, and has a crew of 5. As for the other pilot models, the T7E3 would have a welded hull and turret, and would be fitted with an automatic transmission and twin Hercules diesel engines, while the T7E4 would also be fully welded and have 2 Hydra-Matic transmissions and twin Cadillac engines. As you can see, when it comes to adding the M7 medium tank to War Thunder, we have quite a few options, as we have the various pilot models with their different armaments, armour and engines that could all be added, probably as event tanks, while the production version of the M7 could be added to the regular tech tree, probably at 3.0 between the M3 Lee and M4A1, bridging the gap between these two iconic tanks, and giving American players a faster medium tank than usual, and it would be nice for this often forgotten American medium tank to get some recognition in-game. In real life, the T7E5 was accepted into service, but as the weight was now 26 tonnes, or even 28 to 29 tonnes when fully loaded, only a ton or two less than the Sherman, it would be standardised as the M7 medium tank, and was now set for production. Indeed, an entirely new tank plant was constructed in Bettendorf, Iowa, where the M7 was to be put into production by the International Harvester Corporation, and as you can see in the pictures, this was a very large factory, with quite a few M7 tanks in various stages of construction, showing just how seriously efforts were being made for getting this tank ready for mass service. Of course, you might be wondering why so much effort was being put into a tank that on the face of it was at best equivalent to the Sherman, which was already in mass production, and in many ways was actively worse, all while bringing virtually nothing new to the table, while also complicating logistics and adding a need to retrain existing crews and mechanics to operate the new tanks. Well, as it turns out, Armoured Force also quickly realised the M7 just wasn't good enough compared to the Sherman, and they preferred to stick to that tank. So on the 20th of January 1944, with only 13 tanks being produced in total, but with far more under construction, the M7 medium would be declared obsolete, meaning the US Army would have to stick with the M5 light tank until the introduction of the M24 Chaffee, and a new medium tank would have to wait until near the end of the war. So the M7 medium tank was overall a failure, being too big for a light tank but not being better than the Sherman as a medium tank. But given its originally intended role as a light tank, it was never supposed to replace the Sherman. However, once the Sherman was in full-scale production, some efforts were put into developing various prototypes, these being the T20, T22 and T23, as well as various subvariants of these tanks. And this was in order to test various new components and design features that hadn't been available when designing the Sherman, but also with an idea that one of these could potentially become a successor to the Sherman. So most of these tanks are quite similar to each other, at least with regards to the hull, differing mainly in engines, transmission, and occasionally the armament. So a bit like the Cavalier, Centaur and Cromwell that we looked at in my episode looking at British World War II tanks. So we'll start off by looking at the Fisher-built T20, or more specifically the T20E3, as the T20 itself is already in-game, while the T20E1, which was to be fitted with a 75mm gun with an autoloader, doesn't seem to have been completed, and the T20E2, which was intended to be fitted with a torsion bar suspension and 3-inch gun, in case development of the M1 76mm gun was delayed, was also cancelled, as the 76mm gun wasn't delayed. At this point, however, the torsion bar suspension system was incorporated into the T20E3, which was armed with the 76mm gun, and is otherwise mostly identical to the initial T20, with the new suspension being superior to the VVS suspension as used on Sherman tanks, but it still had a high ground pressure due to the tracks being the same width as those on the Sherman. So as it was built and tested, we could get the T20E3 with its new suspension, probably at 6.0, which honestly I think the T20 could also be reduced to, as while its suspension is better than the Sherman, so is the T20's HVS suspension, while the other stats are more or less the same. But either way, giving American players an extra tank to choose from can only be a good thing, and it would be nice for this testbed to have some success in War Thunder. In real life, the T20 and T20E3 would not be chosen for further development due to various automotive issues, particularly around the Torquematic transmission, which was derived from a transmission designed for lighter tanks, but the experience gained from using the torsion bar suspension system probably came in handy when designing the M24 Chaffee and M26 Pershing, as both these tanks used this suspension. So we can now move on to the second prototype series, the T22, which as mentioned was basically the same as the T20, at least with regards to the hull, but was built by Chrysler, and due to issues with the Torquematic transmission, this reverted to the transmission from the M4 Sherman, which was at least available in great numbers and was proving to be reliable, though these factors wouldn't make much difference in game. However, when the T22 suffered a complete engine failure in testing, it would be rebuilt and redesignated as the T22E1, and in this new guise, it was fitted with the auto-loading 75mm gun that had been intended for the T20E1. So you might be wondering, how much of a difference does an autoloader on a World War II tank make? Well, first of all, this new autoloader allowed for the removal of the loader, which does technically make the tank more vulnerable to being destroyed via crew losses, but they have now been replaced by an autoloader fed from two 32-round magazines, one with AP shells and one with HE shells, though in game it's likely we could change this up, and this gun was capable of firing 20 rounds a minute, or a round every 3 seconds, making this a ridiculously powerful weapon if only through sheer weight of fire. I mean, if you encounter a superior tank, you could easily destroy their barrel and then detract them before they have time to even realise what's happening. Aside from the loss of the loader, the new 75mm gun and new transmission, the rest of the stats should be broadly the same as the T20, and I could see the T22E1 being a good event or premium tank, and to be honest it's going to have to be 5.3 at the very lowest I think, as this weapon, while lacking in punch in the higher tiers, will be one of the fastest firing weapons at tier 3, giving this a unique edge over most enemies, while the loss of a crew member will make this tank slightly more vulnerable in battle, though its armour and decent speed should do it in good stead in battle. Again, like with the T20, there were various mechanical problems with the new design, with the T22 having its engine completely fail, and the T22E1's new autoloader, while giving a good performance when it worked, proved to be very unreliable, and the 75mm gun was itself becoming obsolete, leading to the project's cancellation. However, there was one last concurrent design, the T-23, again built by Chrysler and based off the T-22, though this time using a General Electric transmission, something that is usually associated with German tank designs, allowing for the same top speed in forward and reverse, and 2 pilots were ordered with 76mm guns, and these were actually finished before the T-20 and T-22, with the first pilot model fitted with a welded turret and the second with a cast turret. During testing, the T-23 proved to be the best of these prototype tanks, with the second pilot tank beating the M4A3 and M7 medium tanks in uphill climbs, while the first managed to travel more than 2,000 miles with no major issues. Pleased with these results, 250 T-23s would be ordered, with these to be fitted with a cast turret combining the best features from both the welded and cast turret versions, and the upper frontal plate was increased to 76mm thick, but it retained the VVS suspension from the Sherman, and had a top speed of 35 miles per hour or 56 kilometers an hour with a 5-man crew. I think this would make a good 6.3 tank in War Thunder, as it has thicker hull armour than the T-20, while its electric drive will make it far more effective at escaping ambushes and peeking round corners to take snapshots, and being built in large numbers means it would be a perfect fit in the regular tech tree between the M4A3W and M4 T-26, giving players a chance to play this rather lesser known tank. In real life, despite some early promise and being built in decent numbers, the T-23 was never standardised, so it never got an M number or became the M23. And unfortunately, despite the early promise, it failed to live up to expectations, as the additional weight from the up armouring, the use of the VVS suspension and the electric drive meant that when it was given over to the army for testing in more strenuous conditions than those of General Electric, a whole bunch of issues started cropping up, ranging from cooling issues and high ground pressure to issues with the electric drive itself, especially the fact it required more maintenance to keep it running, not to mention having to retrain mechanics to deal with it, while other minor factors also caused issues with it being used as a combat tank, while the inability to fit a 90mm gun severely limited any future development on the tank. Thus, the T-23 tanks that were built were kept in the United States for training and testing purposes, never being sent to the European or Pacific theatres, somewhat similar to the British Covenanter tank, though at least this tank sort of worked and wasn't built during a time when tanks were desperately needed overseas. However, all was not lost, as the T-23 did see service overseas in a sense, as the cast turret that was designed for the T-23 would end up being adapted for the Sherman tank, which allowed the Sherman to be upgunned with the 76mm gun, giving the Sherman a fighting chance against newer tanks and allowing it to fight until the end of World War II, while the later T-25 would use a redesigned T-23 hull. It should also be mentioned that more variants of the T-23 would be produced for testing, such as the T-23E3 with a torsion bar suspension, which reduced ground pressure compared to the usual T-23 and was actually recommended for standardisation as the M27, but this never went ahead. There were also plans to build the T-23E4 with HVS suspension, but this design was cancelled, though some regular T-23s would be converted to the new suspension, but these were relegated to test tanks. So overall, it might seem like these tanks were all a failure, but they did allow for the development of the better turret for the Sherman tank, while the experience gained with torsion bar suspension systems would no doubt have been invaluable, especially since this would be the suspension of choice for most future American tanks. And if viewed merely as testbeds, I would say these tanks did their job extremely well, though maybe a few less T-23s could have been built, as 250 seems a bit excessive for testing and training. Development would continue with the T-25 and T-26, the former of which is already in-game, and the latter of which I will cover in the heavy tank section. But there was a T-25E1, which differs from the T-25 in that it has a torsion bar suspension system and a more conventional transmission, while weighing around 3 tons less. I think the T-25E1 could work on the regular tech tree, as only 2 T-25s were built, while 40 T-25E1s were built, and no doubt there were differences in some of these 40 pilot models, potentially giving us even more variants to add, and I think this could work at 6.0 to 6.3, either on its own or folded with the regular T-25, and this would give us access to yet another late war American medium tank that was built in decently large numbers. So I think that just about wraps it up for the medium tanks, meaning we can move on to heavy tanks. And to be honest, there aren't a huge amount of American heavy tanks from World War II that need adding, but there are a few, including at least one design that I think will be quite interesting. But we'll start off first with the M6 heavy tank. Now of course we do have many variants of the M6 heavy tank in game, for example the T1E1, M6A1 and M6A2E1. But we don't have the T1E2, which was standardised as the M6 heavy tank, with 8 being built compared to 20 for the T1E1 and 12 for the M6A1. In many ways this is very similar to the M6A1, but as an entirely cast hull, making this look more like the T1E1, which might provide some additional protection from sloping, but this might be cancelled out by the fact that cast armour provides less protection in game. Interestingly, it also seems like the T1E2, before it was standardised, was fitted with a different turret that didn't have a roof-mounted machine gun, but instead had a high elevation machine gun mounted at the rear of the turret, which I can't see being much use in game, while a more prominent commander's cupola was also provided, which might make for an easier target in game, and a machine gun was provided for the driver to use. Obviously, all of these would be changed in the production version as the M6, and for the rest of the stats it seems to be broadly the same as the M6A1. I could see the initial prototype and production version being fitted in War Thunder at 5.0, the prototype as an event vehicle and the M6 being folded with the M6A1, with the prototype T1E2 giving us a slightly different design with a differently designed turret and different machine gun positions, while the M6 would play pretty similarly to the M6A1, with slightly different protection, but it would be nice to see the actual initial M6 heavy tank added in game to go alongside its sub-variants. Of course, the M6 heavy tank program, while technically successful, never saw mass production or any tanks deployed in a combat theatre, with the M4 Sherman seeming to be adequate enough, and it wouldn't be until January 1945 that the first of the new M26 Pershing heavy tanks would be deployed to Europe. Of course, the M26 Pershing technically started off as a medium tank, and was really only classed as a heavy tank from 1945 to 1947. And the M26 in game is also classed as a medium tank, but I'm covering it in this section because it was technically a heavy tank during the war, and as mentioned we do have the M26 in game. But it is a rather unique variant of this tank, the T26E2 or M45. Now the first big thing you might notice about this tank is the shorter barrel, and that's because it's now armed with a vertically stabilised M4 105mm howitzer, the same one as used on the M4A3 105 in game, and it is able to fire smoke, HE shells with a maximum penetration of 26.8mm, and a H shell with 130mm penetration. However, it should be noted that there are post-war shells that could be fired from the M4 howitzer that haven't been added to the game yet, for example the M327 HEP, or High Explosive Plastic, aka a HESH shell, which has a penetration of 127mm, so much the same as other American 105mm HESH shells. There was also the T131E31 heat shell, though I believe this shell was considered more experimental as it was considered too inaccurate for field artillery in testing. But in firing tests against 177mm armour plate, 3 out of 5 shells penetrated. But then in another test against 7-inch plates set at 60 degrees, 12 out of 17 shells completely penetrated, with the remaining 5 penetrating an average of 267mm. So similar to the 90mm Cockerill Mark III on 6.7 to 7.0 vehicles. So if these shells are introduced, this of course makes this vehicle far more deadly. However, the new weapon is much lighter than the 90mm gun, which you might think is a good thing but meant that some rebalancing of the turret needed to be done, which as it turns out meant up armouring the turret, with the mantlet now increased from 114mm of armour to 203mm, the turret face from 101mm to 127mm, and the turret sides from 76mm to 127mm, which increases the tank's weight by 292 kilograms, but leaves it massively more protected, especially from the front and sides of the turret. The top speed seems to be broadly the same at 30 mph or 48 km/h, and the usual crew of 5 is carried. Honestly, trying to find a place for this tank might be a little bit difficult, and is heavily dependent on whether it gets access to the post-war shells or not. If it only gets access to the shells that are already in game, I think it would have to start with the heat shell unlocked stock, and this would make it rather hard to balance, and I couldn't see it being added at any lower than 6.0, and I could even see some arguments against adding it just because the not particularly great penetration from the heat shell and the massive amount of armour would make it very hard to balance. However, if it gets access to the post-war HES shell and even perhaps the heat shell, we suddenly have a few more options with regards to balancing, allowing it to be placed at a higher battle rating, where its improved armour isn't going to be such a massive hindrance to enemies. But either way, I would still like to see this rather interesting tank added to War Thunder in some form or fashion. Ultimately, the T-26E2 wouldn't be ready for production until July 1945, 2 months after the end of the war in Europe, and it had initially been wanted in large numbers, as just before D-Day it had been hoped to halt production of 75mm and 76mm armed tanks, and instead build 75% of new tanks with a 105mm howitzer, and the remaining 25% with 90mm guns. But by January 1945 this ratio had reversed. Thus, with the end of the war and a lessened demand for howitzer tanks, only 185 would be built, as the heavy tank T-26E2 not receiving its M number until May 1946, when it became the medium tank M45. Despite missing the war in Europe, it did see service in the Korean War, but after that it seems they were all scrapped or destroyed, and so no M45s are around today. There was also the T-26, which was essentially the M26 Pershing but fitted with an electric drive, and despite weighing a little over a ton more than the regular M26, in testing it had superior mobility compared to the M26. But as in previous cases with the electric drive, it suffered with regards to reliability and maintenance, and thus wasn't given any further development. But it could be a good tank to have in game, probably at 6.7, maybe 7.0 depending on how much better the mobility is. So having looked at light, medium and heavy tanks, we have nearly finished with the regular tanks of the US Armed Forces. But there are of course amphibious and flamethrower tanks which we can take a quick look at. And when it comes to amphibious tanks, America is in quite a good place, as while tanks like the D.D. Sherman with their flotation screens are somewhat unsuitable to be added due to their inability to fire when on the water, most American designs used flotation devices that didn't prohibit firing on water. Though not all of them. For example, the M3E4 based on the M3 Stuart used a similar flotation device to the D.D. Shermans. This is also a fairly relevant topic as we just received the T-86 amphibious tank as an event vehicle. This essentially being the M18 but adapted for amphibious operations, being a massive vehicle retaining its 76mm gun with a vertical stabiliser and very fast 45mph top speed, but in turn being a massive target with armour that is virtually useless. Of course, the T-86 is now technically in game, and the T-86E1 only differs in being slightly heavier and using propellers to propel itself through the water, unlike the T-86 which uses tracks. But there is also the very similar T-87, which had a shorter hull and was armed with a 105mm howitzer, which along with its thin armour and slower speed, means it could be added at a lower battle rating, perhaps 3.3 or higher, giving us a good counterpart to the T-86 in the lower ranks. It also appears that the turret of the M24 Chaffee was tested on the LVT-A1. No modifications needed to be carried out that weren't finished when the project was cancelled at the end of the war, but it could be added at 3.3 between the M22 and M6A1, filling in a gap in the middle line at rank 2 and giving us an amphibious vehicle that we could use for tier 2. Then there were regular tanks that could be equipped with flotation devices to enable them to perform amphibious operations. For example, the M24 Chaffee used flotation devices that, while heavy and unwieldy on land, give it a top speed of 5.2 mph on water and allow the tank to fire in a 310-degree angle, only unable to fire directly rearward due to folding stacks on the rear deck. As mentioned, the flotation devices are heavy, increasing the total weight of the tank from 18.3 tonnes to 24.7 tonnes, no doubt heavily affecting its top speed and acceleration, but this would give us an amphibious tank with some pretty effective weapons, and could be represented in game as a modification for the M24 if needed, or as a separate variant. Of course, these weren't just available to the light tanks, and there were flotation devices available for the Sherman, these being the T6 or M19 flotation device, and these actually have some advantages over the rather more famous Sherman DD tanks, as these do allow the Sherman to engage enemies while crossing over the water, and while they would be cumbersome once you hit land, these flotation devices could be added rather quickly and easily, either as modifications or as entirely new vehicles in the American tech tree, and they would give American players access to a rather useful, less famous cousin of the Sherman DD tanks that could be used alongside their regular Shermans and bring in light to this lesser known variant of the Sherman tank. There was also the T7 flotation device for the M18, which again I know is technically a tank destroyer, but it feels better to cover it here with the other amphibious tanks. And interestingly, when tested with the T7 flotation device, the M18 was fitted with an elevation gyro stabilizer for the main gun, allowing for more accurate shooting on the move, much like the T86. Again, the T7 does prevent firing directly backwards, and has a lower top speed on water of 4.24 miles per hour, but again it gives us another effective amphibious tank to use in game, again either as a separate vehicle or as a modification to the M18. The T88 GMC, essentially the M18 with a 105mm howitzer, would also be tested with the T7 flotation device, giving us yet another amphibious vehicle that could be added, though I suspect the T88 might be added without amphibious capabilities, at least at first. So with the amphibious tanks out of the way, we now come to the last tanks we will be looking at, which are the flamethrower tanks, which are often very hard to add in game due to the fact they often replace the main armament, which would make them borderline useless. However, there were a number of American designs and modifications that added a flamethrower while retaining the usual main armament. For example, in the Pacific, the M3 Stuart often had flamethrowers placed in the bow machine gun position, and in at least one case had the flamethrower attached to the bow machine gun itself, allowing for both weapons to be retained, and giving us a fast-moving flamethrower tank for the lower tiers. There was also the E9-9 mechanised flamethrower, which had a fuel trailer being towed at the rear of an M5A1, allowing for more fuel for the flamethrower to be carried. But this remained a one-off prototype due to a rather unfortunate accident destroying the prototype, and all 4 crew members being lost as a result, and I could see Gaijin being somewhat wary of touching this tank as a result of how it was lost. There would also be flamethrower tanks based on the Sherman, again with many replacing the bow machine gun with flamethrowers, and adding these variants would be a quick and expedient way of getting effective flamethrower tanks into the American tech tree. But there were more flamethrower tanks that were a bit more specialised. One of these is the Sherman Crocodile, which as the name suggests is similar to the Churchill Crocodile in that a trailer containing fuel is towed behind the tank. This came about from a conference in May 1943, where it was actually concluded that Britain was ahead of the Americans in flamethrower development, and thus these Shermans were actually converted for American use by Britain. And while the initial prototype was an M4A2, the other 3 converted were M4A4s, a variant of the Sherman that wasn't really used much by American forces, making this a rather rare case of its use by US forces. As for the tank itself, the flamethrower is mounted on the right corner of the hull, allowing the bow machine gun to be retained, while the fuel is provided by an armoured trailer towed behind the tank. This would make for an excellent flamethrower tank for the US tech tree, probably at 3.7, giving us a rather unique American flamethrower tank and giving Gaijin a reason to add the M4A4 into the American tech tree. In real life, while it had been hoped to use these during the Normandy invasion, they weren't delivered in time, being kept in the UK until November 1944, only seeing action once during the attack on Jülich in Germany on 24th of February 1945, where they proved to be rather successful. Lastly, when it comes to flamethrower tanks, we have the T-33, which started development in May 1945 by taking the hull of the heavily armoured M4A3E2 with HVS suspension, and combining it with a new turret that had the M6 75mm gun from the M24, a coaxial machine gun, an E20-20 flamethrower mounted to the right of the main gun, and an E21R4 flamethrower by the commander's cupola, with all of these weapons having separate elevation and unfortunately making the turret very cramped, which could be represented by a longer reload rate for the 75mm gun. The 75mm gun is a little less effective as its elevation is now -10 to +13 compared to the +25 for the original turret, while the E20-20 flamethrower's elevation is -15 to +45, with a range of 137 metres and enough fuel for 56 seconds of firing. Meanwhile, the E21 flamethrower has a limited traverse of 240 degrees, elevation of -20 to +20, and a range of just 73 metres, but a much longer firing duration of about 4 minutes. The crew is also reduced from 5 to 4 as the bow machine gun position has been eliminated and plated over to make room for more fuel tanks, making the tank slightly more vulnerable to crew losses and enemy fire in general on account of the extra fuel tanks. All in all, this looks like it would be a very successful flamethrower tank for the US tech tree, retaining an effective main armament and giving us 2 good flamethrower weapons, which would also confuse enemies, as one of the usual ways of disabling a down-tiered Jumbo Sherman is to either fire at the machine gun port, which is going to be missing in this case, or disabling the barrel. Except there are now 2 barrels, so you're going to have to choose which one to shoot, and then even if you do disable both of the barrels in the turret, you still have that flamethrower on the roof, which can be used to obscure the enemy's view and possibly even cause some minor damage or take them out entirely if they're in an open-topped vehicle. Ultimately, this would probably work at 5.7, maybe 5.3 depending on the armour of the new turret, and it would be very nice for this unusual and effective flamethrower tank to be available in War Thunder. In real life, development would be protracted, and only 3 were produced, with the first pilot not being delivered until September 1947, more than 2 years after development had started, while the second and third pilot, the latter of which was the most advanced of all of them, wasn't delivered until January 1948, long after the end of the war, with testing of the tanks taking place until July 1950, and ultimately they were not accepted for service, though 2 were converted into turretless T-68 flamethrower vehicles in 1953, but again after testing were still not accepted for service in this role either. So that brings us to the end of this episode looking at American World War II tanks. I'd be interested to hear your views on these tanks and any other ones you would like me to cover, as there are no doubt many more tanks and variants that I have yet to cover. I will of course cover tank destroyers, armoured cars and anti-air vehicles in a separate video, with the Soviets probably being the next nation I cover, though that is subject to change depending on time and real life events as I've just been very busy lately. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, hopefully you're enjoying the series and will join me for the next episode. I've been Tyranno and I'll see you next time.